Hi again. One of my ideas for when I first started thinking about uploading videos was to do bedtime stories, to read portions of books that mean a lot to me that you might not know of or be able to get your hands on very readily. And today's been a long day, emotionally, intellectually, a lot of stuff's happened. Dan Savage came to my university and I spoke with him briefly, which was really nice. But instead of processing sort of what's happened today, I just feel more like it would be appropriate to share with you a really important piece of a very important book to me. I've read before from Ladelle McWhorter's work, Bodies and Pleasures, and tonight I'm going to read the first of the bedtime stories from this book, Racism and Sexual Oppression in Anglo-America. It's her more recent book that just came out a couple years ago almost. And she's addressing racism and sexual oppression and especially giving the histories, but trying to figure out the relationships and the similarities while paying attention to the differences between the form that anti-black racism, like anti-black racism, the forms that takes and how that meets up with some homophobic or heterosexist attitudes that end up manifesting themselves in rhetoric that's sort of right-wing, especially fundamentalist Christian, focus on the family kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that stuff, pick up this book because it's fabulous. But instead of talking about just that, I'm going to read the end of the book of what she says because it's just awesome. So let's just get into it. This book is not a book of answers, although at times I wish as much as anybody that it could be. Instead, it is an invitation for further work and further thinking. It is intended to extend an open hand toward others who are different from me, toward people who have different experiences and different perspectives, and to provoke creative dialogue and joint struggle. I don't know exactly what to do to make our lives more livable and our communities more respectful and humane, but I do know what we must not do. I know that we must not recoil in the face of the current controversy, hunker down in our relatively insular communities and social circles, and refuse to risk the pain of engagement across real differences. I know that we must not be afraid to offer respectful criticism or to hear criticism however it is offered and examine it thoughtfully. I know that we must not close our ears to anything or anyone labeled abnormal, that is, a politically motivated label wherever it occurs. And we must not tremble with anxiety over whether that label might be attached to us if we assert ourselves in opposition to the status quo. Above all, I know that we must not try to adjust to a society that oppresses us in the vain hope that the consequent lack of conscious discomfort, should we be able to achieve such a state, would be equivalent to happiness, self-affirmation, or liberty. I also know two other things. The first is that, as important as legal opinions and governmental policies are, they alone will never give us any freedom or equality. We who are oppressed in various ways must assert our equality. That is, we must proclaim and bear in our comportment the fact that we deserve the respect and consideration of our neighbors and fellow citizens. We must not ask to be granted anything. We must remind those around us as often as necessary that our moral worth is not dependent upon their assessment of us, nor is it determined by our current inferior status within institutionalized networks of power and knowledge. And we must believe that. And we have to exercise our freedom. That is, we have to conduct ourselves as free people in ways that affirm and actualize the fact that we are free people, which means, first of all, that we have to assume responsibility for our lives and our communities and refuse to be intimidated by threats and debilitating theories, even as we remain alert to the risks we run in ignoring or countering them. Biopolitical networks rely for their stability and growth upon our engagement in self-policing, upon our willingness to discipline ourselves and those around us to meet the standards of function and the direction of development that our assigned roles specify. When we know we're being watched, we're inclined to inscribe the power relation within ourselves, as Foucault puts it, to take on the work of monitoring and forcing ourselves to stay within the dictates of the prevailing norms. He who is subjected to a field of visibility, to normalizing surveillance, and who knows it, assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. We may stave off punishment by responding this way, but at the same time, we do violence to ourselves. We reject fields of possibility, including alternative values, directions for development, and patterns of life. Because authorities and institutions are thus relieved of much of their policing function, the job of maintaining and normalizing hierarchy becomes much easier for them, less costly, less messy, and less overtly violent. The external power may throw off its physical weight, it tends to the non-corporeal, and the more it approaches this limit, the more constant, profound, and permanent are its effects. It is a perpetual victory that avoids any confrontation and which is always decided in advance. The first step toward dismantling biopolitical, that is racist, networks of power, therefore, is to refuse to do their work for them, to refuse to do the work of self and other policing in the name of the normal. Refusing means in part that against the authorized knowledges that tell us that blacks are erratic and violent, that Latinos are impulsive and chauvinistic and too stubborn to learn English, that transgendered people are mentally ill, that gay men are disease-ridden boy rapists, and that lesbians and feminists are Darwinian blind alleys out to destroy heterosexual hearth and home, we must know, actively and adamantly, what we know. And that includes not only what we know about ourselves, in opposition to what they tell us. For example, that we are unwilling to tolerate humiliation politely, that we are violently opposed to the degradation of our lives and our loved ones, that we embrace the novel and the serendipitous while passionately adhering to meaningful traditions, and that we are able to see and think and imagine things that our detractors find too frightening to contemplate, that even when burdened with illness and threatened with ostracism, we can be brave and loving, and that our sensual pleasures and the relationships they enable bring joy to our lives both individually and communally. It also includes what we know about those who would oppress us, that their allegedly rational and disinterested justifications for their actions are rooted in a desire for material gain and a drive for territorial and political hegemony that spans 4 centuries of industrial development and brutal conquest, and that the allegedly objective natural and social sciences they tout were conceived and expounded in service to the racist goal of Anglo-Saxon domination. We know these things. What we don't know is how much explosive power these long dispersed, devalued, and subjugated knowledges could have if they were to coalesce, concentrate, and set themselves loose upon the world. But if we refuse to adhere to the demands and dictates of biopolitical normativity and start paying attention instead to what we know and to how what we know articulates with what others know, racial others, sexual others, the differently embodied, the differently gendered, we will certainly find out. An insurrection of our subjugated knowledges is far more likely than any executive order or legislative innovation or juridical victory to reconfigure the networks of power within which we live our lives. The second thing I know is that the insurrection of our subjugated knowledges is only possible if we stop compartmentalizing oppression on the basis of sociological identity. Of course, it's different to be a middle-class white lesbian and suburban than it is to be a Mexican migrant worker or an Asian graduate student or an African-American teenager in an urban ghetto or an Arab American store owner and a white working-class war veteran facing the rest of his life in a wheelchair. We're all different from each other. We have different histories, and we face some very different obstacles. But if we focus all of our energies on our differences, that is, on our specific and distinct identities as queer or black or disabled or whatever, we will fail to perceive any aspect of the power networks that shape our lives other than the narrow face they present to our own group, and that means that we will inevitably fail to understand those power networks at all. I'm going to keep reading just to keep this so much shorter. She says that over the work that she did in writing this book, she learned a lot of things. She read more history and encountered in 20 years of formal education. She put her childhood memories of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the turbulent 60s in historical perspective. She learned a lot about the concerns, fear, and disagreements among African Americans. And in the process, she learned to relax and play and laugh with Black intellectuals as I came to trust them as peers rather than fear them as judges of my conduct and interiority. I learned to love and appreciate both the style and the courage of sissy boys and diesel dykes and transgendered people of every description, even more than I did before. And through all this lesson that impressed itself deeply into my flesh, is that while some people may in fact be perfect, at least for a fraction of a second in little sparks every once in a while, nobody is normal and nobody ought to be. So she says the point of doing a genealogy, the philosophical work that she does in this book, is that genealogy changes those who undergo it. In both writing and the reading, genealogy is a transformative philosophical practice. It is also, when collectively undertaken and undergone, an incitement to further transformation, a provocation to insurrections against institutions, and practices that perpetuate the arrangements of power of those whose investments genealogies expose. So she says eventually there are a couple things we need to learn, like African American history, but the other thing is that we can do our best, but that means taking up the challenge of inventing what to do in the absence of set models and clear precedents, and of living with the uncertainties and unforeseeable consequences that invention entails. And of course, doing likewise, that is, like our leaders in the Black Civil Rights Movement, for instance, is no guarantee that we shall overcome, or that we shall be overcome as agents and conduits in an order to want to resist and dismantle. But it is, I think, the only open door, the only possibility. Go forth and do likewise, like our role models, which means listen, speak, incite, invent, and never, ever adjust. Well, thank you all for watching.